There are estimates of 30 million bison, 30 to 60 million, but 30 is sort of the rough, most commonly accepted number. And if you lined 30 million bison up nose to tail, they could have gone around the equator 2.5 times. By the time the slaughter was finished in the 1880s, there weren't enough wild bison left to go 2 city blocks. We came very close to losing them. There were, at the same time, in all of North America, there were only, at the low point, 23 wild bison in all of North America, hiding in a remote valley in Yellowstone National Park. At the same time, there was probably 200 to 300 bison on farms and ranches that ranchers had captured from wild populations and put into captivity. And it's those animals that produced their young and have led to the bison populations in North America today.
To confess that I have been guilty of taking part in the extermination of the buffalo. Were it at all to my credit, I could even boast of having just killed a greater number in proportion to the whole number now alive than any other man in this country except Jim McNancy. Between my 3 cowboys and I, we killed about 1/10 of all the buffalo in the United States outside of protective limits. But I blush to own it. And had it not been to save science and the public their skins and skeletons from total loss at the hands of reckless, careful-not cowboys, who now kill for the empty honor of slaughter, those buffalo of ours would now be alive, if not frozen to death and facing the Montana blizzards. And yet, since the cowboys are killing them as fast as they can, regardless of the dictates of sense and humanity, and leaving them to decay where they fall, was it not our sworn duty to step in ahead of them and save something from the wreck? It certainly was. Therefore, curse me no curses for what we did. Bad luck to the rifles that have swept the buffalo away. May dreams of the buffalo slayers be haunted as mine are now by buffalo. I shall never get over the death of my last one. To me, he was the last of his race, and he seemed to feel it as much as I. But for the absolute certainty that some wild cowboy would kill him on the next roundup and leave him to rot where he fell, I swear I would gladly have let him go in peace, and with my blessing too. But it was no time for sentiment. The Philistines were upon him, and to save him from total annihilation, to make him live again, and stand forever in all his magnificence in the Mammal Hall of the National Museum, I slew him. It is a sad thing to say, but the great American bison is practically gone forever. The Pacific Railroad, the Sharps rifle, and man's insatiable destructiveness have done their work, and the noblest ruminant of them all has gone down before them. The leaden hull of their breech shoulder has swept the millions of buffalo from the face of the earth, before a single strong hand has been raised to stop the merciless slaughter. To look back upon the buffalo as they were a few years ago only adds to our regret for their fate.
All bison populations today are descended from around 7 discrete populations. 2 of them had national parks formed around them, and the other 5 were wild caught and raised domestically, and then later re-released into what are now conservation herds. So Yellowstone is the one that's quite famous. It was the first national park in America. I believe it's one of the first national parks in the entire world, and it was founded in 1872 around a refugia of bison. I think there were only about 23 individuals, and their messaging you hear a lot about. You often sometimes hear people talk about those 23 wild bison as if they were the last bison in the entirety of North America. And they were certainly a very important herd. This herd was even protected by American Civil War veterans. So they were protected against poachers by soldiers. And that herd still exists today and has had a lot of really interesting controversies around it. But the Yellowstone herd was the first herd to be protected nationally by the American government. You also have another national park that was formed around a bison herd, and that one's little discussed and definitely not as well known, but that's Wood Buffalo National Park, which is one of the largest national parks in Canada. The landmass, I think, is equivalent to the size of Switzerland, but that park was also founded around a population known as wood bison. So they're considered a separate subspecies. They're taller, they have more angular humps that sit further forward on their shoulders than plains bison. They have behavioral differences that we can't really observe today because we don't have bison herds of 100,000 or more as we had in the past when it comes to plains bison. Wood bison were always in smaller herds of like say 1,000 individuals or less. So we can observe some physical differences between silhouettes and their fur patternings, but there's also behavioral differences that we can't observe as much anymore. All wood bison populations today are descended from the herd that was protected by Wood Buffalo National Park in the 1920s. The population of wood bison, we estimate, got as low as 300 individuals, but it might have been even lower. So the remaining bison herds, aside from Yellowstone National Park and Wood Buffalo National Park, were wild caught by ranchers and then raised domestically for a few years and then reintroduced or into conservation herds. So you have the Charles Goodnight herd in Texas, you have the Bedson herd, which was captured in what's now Canadian territory in like Saskatchewan, and that was captured by James Mackay and Charles Alloway, a pair of Métis hunters who later became translators and actually legislators as well. James Mackay was an MLA in the Northwest Territories. They sold their herd to Samuel Bedson, who was the head of the penitentiary, I believe in Winnipeg, and so those bison were raised kind of on the penitentiary ground. So that herd was the Canadian caught herd, if you will. You also have Charles Jesse Buffalo Jones, who was a Wild West kind of person. All the photographs I've seen of him, he's always wearing a buckskin jacket and quite smug expression on his face, but he was very much involved in bison conservation. He captured 50 or so individuals in the Texas Panhandle, raised them in Kansas. He later bought bison from the Bedson herd when it was distributed at Bedson's death, and that herd eventually got sold to Montana. Now in Montana, you have a herd, the story always went that Samuel Walking Coyote, who was a Salish man living in what's now Montana, captured 4 or maybe 6 young bison calves after one of the last great bison hunts of the 1870s. It's said that these calves followed his horse home. He raised those bison for about 10 years till he had about 13 of them, and then sold them to a pair of mixed blood ranchers, Charles Allard and Michel Pablo. Charles Allard was Métis of French and Cree descent, and Michel Pablo had a Blackfoot mother and a Mexican father, and he was married to a Lakota woman. So they had family connections to the Flathead Indian Reservation. That's the story that Michel Pablo told in the early 1900s to newspapermen, that he bought them from Walking Coyote, that Walking Coyote had captured these bison. New oral history evidence suggests that there were other people involved.
So in the early 1860s, Atatitse, Peregrine Falconrobe, had proposed this idea of bringing orphaned bison calves back over to the reservation with the vast rangeland that we had here to raise them, and that way the people here would not have to go across the mountains and get into intermittent skirmishes with other tribes and the dangers that lied therein with that situation. So basically proposed that idea to the leadership at the urgence of his mother. And initially they liked the idea, but after several days of discussion, there were many people that said, yes, but this kind of lifestyle is what keeps our people strong through discipline and hard work. So the idea was pulled from the table by Falconrobe, And basically, some years went by. By 1878, his own son, Tlatati, Small Falcon Robe, had been tasked with the leadership of going across the mountains and bringing back some bison calves. And it's estimated that he went into northern Montana across the mountains. Some would even argue maybe into lower Canada. And nonetheless brought back, some say 6 bison calves, some say 4. Some of the accounts vary in that regard. However, and this was in 1878, by 1882 roughly, that small group had grown into 13 bison. And the way Blind Mo Chaute, who related this story, an elder that passed away back in the 1980s, however was born in 1891, the way he relates it is that Latati, Small Falcon Robe, as any young man would go off visiting friends and relatives in the various parts of the reservation, and one day returned back to his mother's ranch where his bison were, and they were gone. And basically he went to his mother, and said, "Chentluin Quiquai, where's my buffalo?" And his stepfather, a man by the name of Sam Walking Coyote, or Samuel, had sold the 13 bison to 2 men, tribal members, Charles Allard and Michel Pablo. These were 2 mixed blood stockmen that raised cattle, but purchased these bison and took them in and grew the herd, and also in the interim had added to this herd of bison from Latati and his stepfather Sam Walking Coyote.
And so my great-great-grandfather, Atatitsa Peregrine Falcon's Robe, had a relationship to the bison. And there's stories out there that shows that relationship. During hard times out there, he helped call upon the bison to help feed the people. And it happened that way, where they came to the camp and they sacrificed their lives because of our relationship with the natural world. They will sacrifice their life for us. They will give up their life to feed us, because that's that relationship that we have with them, with the natural world, with the winds, the stars, the colors of the rainbow, everything in this world. We have a relationship. And so that's part of the story of Atatitsa. Another part was where the people were out on the plains and they were coming back from the plains, coming back to this side of the continental divide, and the herd of bison were following them, following the camp. And they wanted to come over. They wanted to come over, follow the people over. And Atatitsa approached the chiefs and said, "What shall we do? The bison want to follow us over here." And the chiefs couldn't decide after 2 or 3 days. So after they couldn't decide, he just went back and told the bison that they have to go back on the plains again, this herd. And they turned around and went back. So that's his relationship that he had. So Atatitsa san Tlatati, which means Little Falcon's Robe. His English name became Joseph Blanket-Hawk. Joseph Blanket-Hawk, Tlatati, Little Falcon's Robe. He had a relationship, and I don't know exactly, that would be my great-grandfather, my mom's grandfather, paternal grandfather, Tlatati. And when he was out on the plains, there were some calves that came with him, came back over this way from the plains. And that was how his herd started. And his homestead was over by just west of where the bison range is now. His land bordered, his homestead allotment bordered where the bison range is now on the west side. And as I understand it, his dad, Atatitsa, had a cabin or had a homestead that was on the bison range itself now. So Slatati had a herd, and his little herd that he had kept growing, and I don't know how many, they say 12, 20 something bison, and from what I understand as the story goes, that Slatati was gone in the late 1800s or so, 1880s or 1890s, and while he was gone, two people approached his mom and his stepfather. His mom was Mary Sabine, Slatati's mom, Mary Sabine, and his stepfather, Samuel Walking Coyote, or Samuel Walking Coyote. And while Slatati was gone, you could say, could have been in Washington, Idaho, or up north visiting some of the Kootenai people up there, and while he was gone, Michel Pablo and Charles Allard approached Slatati's mom and stepfather, and apparently Samuel Walking Coyote sold them, even though they weren't his to sell. He sold them. And there's some more stories I could go into about what some of our family think about Samuel Walking Coyote, the kind of person that he was, but I don't want to start bad-mouthing him on his personality and how he was, but our family knows how he was. But he sold them. And for a long time, even me as a younger person, visiting the bison range as I grew up around the Dixon area, which bordered town of the bison range, seeing the bison range. Oh, the story I heard as a young person was Allard Pablo saved the buffalo. In a way, they helped save. Their herd grew bigger and bigger. But before there was Allard and Pablo, there was Slatati and his little herd that he had. And that story was never told. At the bison range, all it said for the longest time, Allard Pablo. And then, not too long ago, all of a sudden Samuel Walking Coyote name starts popping up. But my family knew the Slatati, Atatitsa, their relationship to the bison itself.
Pablo and Allard raised that herd together for about 20 or so years. They had bought some bison from Buffalo Jones, who, as you'll recall, had bison blood from Kansas, Texas, and what's now Canada. So when Pablo and Allard purchased those bison, even though bison had experienced this pretty tight genetic bottleneck, the Pablo Allard herd, considering all of that, is fairly genetically diverse. Even after Allard died, Michel Pablo continued to raise those bison through to the early 1900s, when a series of political machinations culminated in the need for him to sell off his bison.
In 1909, Teddy Roosevelt, who was then president of the United States, seized roughly 18,000 acres of reservation land to create the National Bison Range. And the Conrad family sold their portion, which was at that time roughly 36 head of bison, to be the seed herd for the National Bison Range. Other shares of the Allard family's bison, some of which were sold to the Yellowstone National Park. So one could ascertain from that a portion of Latati's bison ended up both on the National Bison Range as well as the Yellowstone National Park, which both have thriving herds to this day. And Michel Pablo had continued raising his bison, and one has to remember that back in those days, the Flathead Reservation was open grazing land. There were no fences, so he could basically have his bison roam freely, primarily along the Flathead River, and things had gone on that way for several years. However, in 1904, the federal government instituted the allotment program on the Flathead Indian Reservation, which basically opened up the Flathead Indian Reservation to white settlers. And the tribes were forced to sell upwards of 400,000 acres of land. Now, at that time, a couple of years prior, one of the Indian agents that was in service to the federal government on the Flathead Reservation was fired from his position, Agent Smead, who, once hearing that the reservation was going to be opened up, using his knowledge of the Flathead Reservation and its land and his ideas of what areas would have the most agricultural potential, created a real estate book which he distributed across the United States, trying to encourage white settlers to come here and buy land at below market rates. And during this time, from roughly 1905 to 1910, numerous tribal leaders wrote letters to Washington, D.C., trying to protest this decision, saying that it was unjust and that it abrogated or broke the Hellgate Treaty, which was written with the federal government between the tribes here in 1855. Those letters were largely ignored. The one response from the Office of Indian Affairs, which was the precursor of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that we have today, basically responded that they were going to still follow through with the act and opening up the reservation, because in their words it was for the good of the tribes and they would do better for it, which history tells us was not the case. However, once Michel Pablo heard that the reservation was going to be opened up, he knew that he could no longer freely graze his bison and he would be forced to sell. Michel Pablo made numerous approaches to the U.S. government, stating that he would be willing to sell the bison for roughly $250 a head. The U.S. Congress had declined the offer, despite the fact that the bison was close to extinction in the lower 48 states. However, the U.S. or the Canadian government had heard about this opportunity and were more than willing to take on these bison, which at that time basically were in the neighborhood of about 700 head of bison.
The first action ever taken in Canada to secure an endangered species and bring it back from extinction or near extinction was taken in the buffalo paddock in Banff Park in the 1890s, when a small conservation herd of purebred bison was collected there. And then an even more important event occurred that profoundly changed the future of bison, of plains bison in the world, when Superintendent Howard Douglas of Banff National Park was contacted by the Canadian government agent in Montana to say that the largest surviving herd of bison, which was in private hands at the time, in the hands of a man named Michel Pablo, was for sale. And Pablo had approached the government of Canada to say, do you want to buy it? Because the US government doesn't want to buy it. And that deal was cooked up when Howard Douglas came and talked to a Banff resident named Norman Luxton, who had connections to Frank Oliver, who was the Canadian Minister of the Interior. And the government of Canada bought the herd and shipped it north. And that's the foundation of the herd in Elk Island National Park, which is the foundation of the greatest genetically pure bison that are disease-free, that is restoring bison everywhere. And some of those bison actually came to Banff Park too at the same time.
So the agreement was struck in 1907. What was called the Great Bison Roundup happened here from 1907 all the way. I think the last few bison were finally rounded up by 1911, 1912, which was a huge undertaking. You can imagine taking wild bison and trying to round them up and put them onto rail cars through loading chutes. There were hand-picked some cowboys with extraordinary ability that were able to complete this task. However, there were some bison that just refused to be rounded up, and those bison kind of ran wild for several years, and eventually most of them were shot, one would argue illegally, and but the bison herd was shipped by rail car up into Canada.
Pablo would take charge and head out with the 40 or 50 cowboys, direct each rider to his position. This always took the shape of a horseshoe, the riders being the horseshoe with the buffalo between the heels of the shoe. Careful riding, no noise, not even smoking was allowed. Gradually, the riders would draw closer to the scattered buffalo until they were well bunched. Then the slow trek forward in the direction the herd must be driven, to the shipping corrals at Reveille on the Great Northern Rye. Sometimes these drives went along without any trouble of animals trying to break away from the bunch. No running ahead of the herd. And just about the time we would really think we could get them into a strange country to them and off their regular grazing ground, suddenly the whole herd halted. As if someone had given the command, they would face about to the direction they had come. Stand if at ease. Hardly an animal would be moving in perhaps the 100 or more animals we had been following. All the cowboys stood their horses without a move. No smoking, no talking, like it would have been if the buffalo hadn't been cattle. Then, from a jump start, the buffalo would charge right into the horseshoe-shaped riders, never swerving for any horse or horses, driving straight ahead as if possessed with the devil riding them. They were in their own country and apparently knew where they would end. Even the big Pend Oreille River they took in their mad stampede. Then it would be days again before they were thrown back across the river in dribs and drabs of perhaps half a dozen at a time, to be once more gathered for a drive to the shipping point. As we went along, we learned. We found if we had more cows and fewer bulls, we would sometimes get them to Reveille. A bunch of cows alone was almost a sure bet. It was the cows that we really wanted. A few bulls would do. So it took pretty well all that summer of 1909 to corral enough buffalo to load 13 cars. We have had very poor luck with the buffalo. So far, only 80 have been corralled. They are just too wild for anything, charging right through a line of horsemen to get back on their range. They're going to give them one more trial, and then commence to load what they have got, which means a week or 10 days more. We went onto the buffalo ranch yesterday. Pablo, the owner, had 66 in the corrals from the day before. Yesterday, we saw him and his cowboys round up some 200 head and drive them for 15 miles as the run, and every one of them got away. Pablo is now getting together 50 cowboys, and on Monday, we will see one of the greatest sights ever beheld. I do not know yet if I will stay to the end. It is taking longer than I expected, as it will take all next week to get them to Pablo's ranch, and from there to the station, about 30 miles. The loading of these animals that weighed from 1,000 pounds or more for the cows and a ton or more for the bulls was a job that would enjoy any rancher. Here was where we had the buffalo fades to a frazzle, but patience was the password always. The corrals were so constructed that from the big yard where the main herd stood, a small corral led from it, and from this smaller yard, a chute led into the car. These stock cars had been specially built for the job by the railway company, reinforced from every angle with a water trough running down one side of the car made of iron and holding several barrels of water. Of course, the joke was to get the buffalo into the car. For that matter, it was a joke to get a buffalo anywhere to the place wanted. In this case, the buffalo was driven into the small yard, then prodded and pushed up the chute. Halfway up, his head went into a loop of heavy rope, a knock in the rope preventing it from choking the buffalo to death.
There are several artists who clearly were standing right next to each other when they were taking photographs because they have almost the exact same framing, which I find very fascinating. There was one photographer called Forsyth who was working with stereographs. So he was taking photographs with a specialized camera with two lenses, same distance apart as human eyeballs, taking photographs simultaneously, printed side by side with a special reader means you have 3D images of the Great Buffalo Roundup. So it was quite spectacular. These bison were being herded effectively into corrals and then onto train carts to be taken north of the Medicine Line up into Canadian territory. And originally the intent was for the Canadian government to create an entirely new national park called Buffalo National Park near Wainwright, Alberta. But the fences weren't ready in time. And this was a bit of a rush job, as you'll recall, because the American government was quite impatient and only gave Pablo a year or two to clear the bison herd off of this land that they were going to open up to settlement. And so in the meantime, the Canadian government had to find a place to put these bison that they were shipping north. And they settled on a small little elk preserve, as a federally controlled game preserve called Elk Park, which had been created the year before in 1906. And it was entirely fenced and near a rail station. So they shipped up the first several shipments of bison to the town of Lamont, built a fenced corridor down to the fences of Elk Island, and herded the bison down into the national park. And so it was a bit of a way station for several years and also caused a sensation. Postcards were printed, people drove up from the city of Edmonton to watch these bison being unloaded. Those bison were there as a large herd of several hundred individuals for several years until the fences at Wainwright were ready. A small herd of bison did remain behind at what became Elk Island National Park, and it's those bison there, that seed herd, that became the nucleus for the herd of plains bison that's still at Elk Island National Park today. So those bison continued on to Buffalo National Park. There were several further shipments directly from Montana to Buffalo National Park, but things went a little bit awry. They were, in fact, a victim of their own success.
So part of the reason that the Dominion government was interested in acquiring the plains bison were reasons of nostalgia and the symbol that the bison represented, this disappearing sort of Wild West, and the fact that they were almost near the brink of extinction. Them being able to purchase this herd and bring them back and conserve them and preserve them and increase their numbers was seen as, I guess, somewhat a challenge, but also and something that brought a lot of excitement with it. And I think this excitement at the beginning of acquiring the herd, and initially they did put quite a bit of expense into purchasing the herd because they had set aside $100,000, but when they realized it was going to cost more, they set aside $75,000 more to purchase the herd. So all this money and excitement went into the purchase years, but they hadn't at the time thought about how they were going to sustain this herd.
One of the big events, I think, was, and there are actually pictures of it, was when the bison actually arrived in Wainwright, and I believe that was in 1909. And there's pictures of them being unloaded from the freight cars. And people in those days, when they went to an event like that, they definitely had their best shirt and tie on and jacket. The ladies were dressed in their long dresses and beautiful hats. It was a big deal. And so the whole thing was important. Certainly the tourism for a while at least was important as well. I think the maximum tourism yearly visitation was around 18,000, which is a lot of people for a little tiny community like Wainwright, which had been started in about 1908 when the rail went through the Grand Trunk Pacific Rail.
So they moved bison from Montana, mostly from the Michel Pablo bison herd, but also a few from the Conrad herd, which was also related to the Pablo herd. And they also moved bison from Banff as well. And then they moved 2 shipments from Elk Island. So the first 2 shipments that went there, they also moved down to Wainwright. So in total, they moved 748 bison to the Wainwright Park. And then within 4 years, those had already increased to over 2,000 bison. And initially, this was seen as quite exciting because the herd was increasing and this species that was on the brink of extinction was increasing, and so it was seen as really exciting. The only thing was that these bison were in a park on the prairies, and so because they couldn't migrate and because they were increasing on this area that was not seen as sustainable for agriculture, so this herd was increasing, and so they had issues with overpopulation, and then there was also other issues of them overgrazing the range, and those were two related, and also disease, another issue that came up as well. With the overpopulation, they knew they had a problem on their hands, and they were running out of feed, especially in the mid-20s when there was drought at different years, and so they just were trying to figure out how to solve this problem. So they decided initially to start culling the herd, and so the first cull they did was in 1922, and they culled 265 animals, but it was just an experimental cull, and one of the things they found in this cull there was the presence of some of the carcasses were condemned, and they didn't really mention why they were condemned, but the next year many of them were condemned because of tuberculosis.
Buffalo National Park became quite popular. It had large populations of bison, elk, pronghorn, even yaks were introduced. There was this idea that bison were on an evolutionary spectrum. At this time in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was presumed that evolution was always leading towards some sort of perfection, and the idea was, the European cattle are the perfection, the form that evolution is striving for, and yaks would be an intermediary stage. So there were even some interbreeding experiments by the Canadian government, interbreeding bison with yaks and bison with cattle. So you had these things called catalo or beefalo.
So another way that they tried to make the bison herd useful was the Dominion government brought in a catalo experiment from Ontario in 1915. So this catalo experiment had been started by Moisen Boyd, and he had crossed bison with domestic cattle, and then he was trying to produce the offspring and trying to cross that to create a catalo. His idea was to create an animal that could forage on the cold, wet Canadian climates and be just a better beef quality, and so the Dominion government took this over, and it was a joint experiment, I guess, with the Department of Agriculture, and they had this in the park. And so the reason they placed it in Buffalo National Park is because they had a bison herd that they could use as part of this experiment. And so it seems like nowadays this would be something that would not happen in a national park, but at this time this is something that they did. And so it wasn't that successful. They came up against the same issues that Moisen Boyd had. But in the end, even though this experiment continued on into 1950s and actually moved to Many-Berry, Alberta after that, they just never had any success with it here.
Soon enough, they saw evidence of disease. So then there was also overpopulation problems. The national park had been chosen in part because it hadn't made good farmland, which meant that when the bison population really started to increase and get into thousands, even 6,000 or 7,000 bison, there wasn't necessarily enough grazing to sustain such a large herd, particularly when you also account for the elk and other large animals there. So in the 1920s, the Canadian government needed to find a new solution for what to do with these excess bison. Now, in the entirety of North America, bison were still very much in danger of extinction, but in this particular area, there was this huge overpopulation problem. They had done some culling, but culling such a large number of bison would be very politically unpopular. And so the Canadian government sent around 6,000 young plains bison, first by train and then by barge, up north to Wood Buffalo National Park, to the southern borderlands there. The idea was that the two populations, the ones that of wood bison further north in the park, would never meet the plains bison that were being introduced because there was unpassable muskeg. And there was some presumptions about, there's probably the same kind of bison anyway. We don't have to make any particular take any particular precautions. There was also this assumption that young bison couldn't get tuberculosis, but in fact they present symptoms of the disease differently. So they introduced a whole bunch of young bison, but within a few years staff members noticed evidence of hybridization and then also signs of disease in the wood bison population. And so even at the time, in the 1920s, there were researchers, there were conservationists who criticized the government for introducing these plains bison into Wood Buffalo National Park. It was seen to be like, oh, it's an easy solution. But even so, it went forward. Because again, there were limited spaces where you could introduce 6,000 plains bison. And so by the 1930s and the 1940s, wood bison were considered effectively hybridized out of existence. And that was how it was through to the 1950s, when some researchers noticed a very small, very isolated herd in the furthest northern parts of Wood Buffalo National Park that seemed to display all the characteristics of pureblood wood bison. Population was captured, they were analyzed, and it was decided that yes, this was our best chance of protecting a quote pureblood wood bison. Some were sent up further north to the other side of a large lake, theoretically actually impassable territory this time, that became another conservation herd, the Mackenzie River conservation herd, and then the rest were sent down to Elk Island National Park near Edmonton, put in a separate fenced area from the plains bison, and that was the population. That population there is the origin of many other wood bison populations today. Now, when they did arrive at Elk Island, they did find evidence of brucellosis, and so the park staff there took a pretty extreme way of preventing brucellosis from being passed on. Bovine brucellosis is passed on through fluids, so particularly through nursing mothers to their calves. And so in this particular case, once the mother bison had given birth to their babies, the mothers were slaughtered and the babies were bottle fed, and thus breaking that transmission of disease. So that's how the wood bison population at Elk Island became disease-free. And again, it's those bison from which we get other wood bison conservation herds today. So Elk Island National Park is the heart of bison conservation in Canada. It contains the seed herds for both wood bison as well as plains bison conservation herds. If you've seen bison somewhere in Canada, odds are they had an ancestor that passed through that park. Without the intervention of the Canadian government to save one segment of the Pablo Allard herd from the ravages of colonialism, effectively, and preserving them in Elk Island National Park, sending them to other conservation projects throughout Canada, even the United States, I don't think we would have the same robust and healthy bison populations we do have today.
The bison here propagated and basically were run by the federal government. Most of the, I would say almost all of the employees were non-Indians that were employed here. And finally, various attempts by the tribes, the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, to get the bison range back into tribal possession were attempted unsuccessfully. However, I am really proud to say last year, after many years of attempts, the federal government turned the bison range back over to the tribes and are being run successfully by the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes to the present.
I'm Atatitsa, my great-great-grandfather. My DNA, his blood flowing in my blood. Not just mine, because Atatitsa has a lot of relatives still living on this land, on this reservation, another reservation, the bloodline. But we haven't forgotten. It's our bloodline, our DNA. Our people are so happy to have the land back. And the land is more than just a piece of property. It's like having part of our body given back to us. Maybe we're missing something in our body, our spiritual bodies of life. and getting the land back, the bison range. We feel like we've become more whole again. But we have the land back, the bison that come from Slatati. That DNA is with them on the bison range.